Harlem had already learned how violence sounded. What it was about to learn that night was how limits worked. The incident didn't begin with a weapon or a confrontation in the street. It began with a man crossing a line he didn't understand, or chose not to. A public moment, a careless word, a gesture that showed disrespect toward the family of Bumpy Johnson. Not an attack, not a challenge, just enough to signal that someone believed the rules didn't apply to them. That belief didn't last long. What followed wasn't immediate. There was no crowd, no shouting, no retaliation in the moment. People nearby noticed what had happened, and then they did something far more telling. They stepped back. Conversations stopped. Eyes turned away. The street didn't react loudly. It registered. In Harlem, that difference mattered. Because by 1964, power didn't need to announce itself. It operated through understanding, through shared memory, through lines that were never written down but were universally recognized. And family was one of those lines. Not symbolic, not negotiable, absolute. The man who crossed it walked away thinking nothing had happened. The neighborhood knew better. What made the night unforgettable wasn't what anyone saw. It was what everyone waited for. Harlem didn't ask what Bumpy Johnson would do. It didn't speculate. It didn't gossip. It simply adjusted its behavior, as if the outcome were already decided and time was the only variable left. That waiting created pressure no confrontation ever could, because when no one intervenes, no one warns, and no one explains, the message becomes unavoidable. The line has already been drawn. By morning, there were no headlines, no public reckoning, no visible response. And yet, from that night forward, everyone in Harlem knew exactly where the boundary was, and why it would never be tested again. This story isn't about revenge. It's about how a community learns its limits and remembers them. By 1964, Harlem had changed the way it handled power. The chaos of earlier years had given way to something quieter, more controlled. A system of boundaries understood without being enforced publicly. Violence still existed, but it was no longer random. It followed rules, and the most important rules weren't written anywhere. At the center of that order stood Bumpy Johnson. By this point, Bumpy wasn't defined by confrontation. He was defined by predictability. People knew where conflicts ended, what behavior would be tolerated, and which lines were never crossed. That predictability was valuable, not just to the street, but to the neighborhood itself. It reduced chaos. It kept disputes contained. And it allowed daily life in Harlem to function without constant disruption. Family sat at the top of that hierarchy, not as a symbol and not as a threat, but as a boundary. Disputes happened between men. Business disagreements were handled quietly. Insults between rivals were absorbed or redirected, but family existed outside all of that. It wasn't leverage, it wasn't currency, it was off limits. This wasn't unique to Bumpy Johnson. Harlem operated on a shared understanding that once family was pulled into a conflict, the rules changed completely. The issue stopped being personal and became communal. Not because people felt obligated to intervene, but because instability followed when that boundary collapsed. And instability was something Harlem had learned to avoid. By the mid-1960s, the neighborhood had internalized a lesson that outsiders often missed. Loud enforcement attracted attention, and attention brought pressure from outside forces that rarely understood local balance. Quiet correction preserved order. It allowed the community to resolve issues internally without inviting chaos from the outside. That context matters, because when the incident occurred later that night, it wasn't judged in isolation. It wasn't measured by the severity of the act, but by what it represented. A man didn't just act out of line. He signaled that he either didn't understand the structure he was standing in or believed it didn't apply to him. Both interpretations were dangerous, and everyone who witnessed it understood that immediately. This is why no one reacted in the moment. No confrontation was necessary. Responding too quickly would have turned a boundary violation into a spectacle. Harlem didn't need a spectacle. It needed clarity. So the neighborhood did what it had learned to do best. It waited. Because in Harlem, waiting wasn't indecision. It was the space where consequences took shape, quietly, deliberately, and without explanation. The moment itself was brief, almost ordinary. That's what made it dangerous. It happened in public, but not loudly. A comment made with the assumption that it would pass, a gesture that carried more meaning than force. Enough to signal disrespect, not toward a man, but toward the family of Bumpy Johnson. No threat followed it. No confrontation escalated. On the surface, it looked like something that could be ignored. But nothing about it was accidental. In Harlem, people knew the difference between ignorance and intention. And this crossed that line. The man wasn't testing Bumpy directly. He was testing whether the boundary itself still existed, whether the rules everyone lived by were real, or just stories people told each other. Those nearby noticed immediately, not because anyone reacted, but because everyone stopped doing what they were doing. Conversations ended without resolution. Faces turned away. The space around the man subtly opened, as if distance itself were a signal. No one stepped in to correct him. No one warned him. No one escalated the situation. That absence was the response. In neighborhoods like Harlem, public correction carried consequences. Calling something out meant owning what came next. And this wasn't a moment for ownership. It was a moment for recognition. The people who witnessed it understood that reacting would only interfere with a process already in motion. Because once a line like that was crossed, the outcome no longer depended on volume or speed. It depended on memory. Words spread quickly but quietly, not as gossip, not as a rumor exaggerated by emotion, just a fact passed along with minimal detail. Someone had crossed the line. No names needed, no instructions given. Everyone understood what that meant, and what it didn't. Harlem didn't speculate about punishment. It didn't predict violence. It didn't ask questions. The neighborhood adjusted its posture instead. Certain spaces closed themselves. Certain conversations stopped happening. The man who had caused the moment wasn't avoided out of fear. He was avoided out of finality. He went on with his night unaware that anything had changed. But around him, the environment had shifted. Not dramatically, precisely. This is the part outsiders never saw. Disrespect wasn't met with chaos. It was met with withdrawal. And withdrawal carried its own weight. It meant the situation had moved beyond immediate response, beyond negotiation, into a space where outcomes were no longer public. By the time the night ended, nothing visible had happened. And that's what made it irreversible. Because in Harlem, once a line was crossed and acknowledged, silently, collectively, there was no returning to before. The street didn't need to react. It had already decided that the moment mattered. And from that point on, the question wasn't if the line would be enforced. It was how quietly. The most dangerous part of the night wasn't the moment of disrespect. It was what came after. Hours passed without reaction. No confrontation, no warning, no visible response from Bumpy Johnson or anyone connected to him. For an outsider, the absence might have looked like forgiveness or indifference. In Harlem, it meant the opposite. Waiting was never passive here, it was deliberate. People understood that immediate retaliation turned boundary violations into spectacles. Spectacles attracted attention. Attention brought outsiders, and outsiders disrupted the balance everyone relied on. So the neighborhood did what it had learned to do over years of pressure and correction. It allowed time to stretch. That stretch carried weight. The man who crossed the line began to notice small changes without understanding their meaning. Familiar faces became distant. Conversations ended when he approached. Places he normally moved through felt colder, less welcoming, harder to read. No one explained why. No one confronted him. The silence followed him like a shadow that refused to identify itself. This was the waiting Harlem trusted, because consequences delivered too quickly can be challenged. They can be argued against, denied, reframed. Consequences that arrive after silence feel inevitable. They don't ask permission. They don't invite negotiation. They simply exist. Inside the neighborhood, no one speculated openly. There was no debate about what should happen. That decision had already been made the moment the line was crossed. The only uncertainty left was timing, and timing belonged to those who understood restraint. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to signal anything. He didn't need intermediaries or messages. His role in this phase was defined by absence. When nothing comes back immediately, people fill the space with understanding. They remember past lessons. They recall how lines had been enforced before, not loudly, not publicly, but permanently. That memory did the work. The waiting also served another purpose. It stripped the moment of emotion. What remained wasn't anger or pride, but clarity. The issue had nothing to do with ego. It was about order, about reminding everyone where stability began and ended. As the night moved toward morning, the neighborhood settled into normal rhythms, but with an adjustment. People knew the story, and they behaved accordingly. The man at the center of it all was no longer part of that rhythm, not excluded dramatically, just out of sync. And in Harlem, being out of sync was dangerous. By the time the waiting ended, quietly, without announcement, no one needed an explanation. The lesson didn't require repetition. It didn't need witnesses. It lived on as memory, reinforced by absence. That's why the wait mattered more than any immediate response ever could. Because once Harlem learned to let silence do the work, the line didn't need to be defended again. It simply existed. When the shift finally happened, it didn't announce itself. There was no confrontation to point to, no public reckoning to remember. The change appeared in patterns, subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking, decisive enough that no one questioned what they meant. The man who had crossed the line didn't vanish overnight. He simply stopped being where he used to be. Certain places became unavailable to him without explanation. Familiar rooms felt colder. Conversations ended earlier than before. People who once acknowledged him now moved past without recognition. It wasn't hostility. It was removal. Harlem didn't punish him. It reclassified him. That distinction mattered. This wasn't revenge carried out in anger. It was correction carried out in silence. And silence made it permanent. Without spectacle, there was nothing to challenge, nothing to retaliate against, nothing to reinterpret as misunderstanding. The boundary was enforced not by force, but by consensus. At the center of that consensus was Bumpy Johnson, not as an active enforcer, but as the reference point everyone understood. The line wasn't drawn that night. It had always been there. What happened was that it became visible. People adjusted their behavior accordingly. Disputes elsewhere continued, but with a clearer edge. Arguments stopped short. Words were chosen more carefully. Family once again was treated as untouchable territory. No one needed to say it out loud. The memory of that night did the work. What made this moment different from earlier years was the absence of fear. No one whispered about what might happen next. They behaved as if the outcome had already been absorbed into the fabric of the neighborhood. That absorption was the real enforcement mechanism. From the outside, nothing appeared to have changed. There were no headlines, no rumors dramatic enough to travel beyond Harlem. To the city, it was an uneventful night among many others. To the neighborhood, it was a recalibration. The line had been tested, and the response proved that it didn't need defending loudly to hold. This was the kind of order Harlem preferred by 1964. Quiet, predictable, unavoidable. It reduced chaos without inviting attention. It allowed people to move forward without reopening the issue or explaining it to anyone else. By the time days passed, the incident no longer needed to be referenced. Its lesson had already been learned. Not through intimidation, but through clarity. Because the strongest boundaries aren't the ones enforced with noise. They're the ones no one dares to cross again. The real outcome of that night didn't belong to the man who crossed the line. It belonged to everyone who watched and adjusted. In the weeks that followed, Harlem didn't talk about what had happened. There were no stories repeated on street corners, no exaggerated versions passed around for effect. The incident faded from conversation almost immediately, but behavior told a different story. People were more careful, not fearful, precise. Disputes that might once have drifted toward personal territory stopped earlier. Words were chosen with more intention. Jokes that brushed too close to family ended before they landed. It wasn't enforced by threat. It was enforced by memory. Everyone knew what the line was now, and more importantly, they knew it didn't need to be defended again. That was the lesson Harlem absorbed. The presence of Bumpy Johnson became less about authority and more about reference. He didn't need to intervene because the neighborhood had internalized the rule. Family was not leverage, not provocation, not collateral. It existed outside conflict entirely. This shift mattered, because once a boundary becomes shared knowledge, enforcement stops being personal. It becomes structural. No one needs to threaten consequences when the consequences are already understood. That's how order sustains itself quietly, through collective discipline rather than visible force. From the outside, Harlem looked unchanged. Life continued. Businesses opened. Streets stayed busy. There was no spike in violence, no visible crackdown, no retaliation that demanded attention. To outsiders, nothing had happened. Inside the neighborhood, everything had been clarified. The line wasn't about loyalty to one man. It was about preserving a system that worked. A system where disputes stayed contained, where escalation was optional, and where certain spaces, especially family, remained untouched. That's why the night mattered. Not because it ended with punishment, but because it ended with understanding. Once Harlem learned the line, it didn't need reminders, it didn't need warnings, and it didn't need to test it again. The most effective rules aren't enforced repeatedly. They're enforced once, so completely that no one ever asks where they are again. What Harlem learned in 1964 wasn't a lesson about fear, it was a lesson about structure. That night didn't end with a spectacle because it didn't need one. The boundary had already been absorbed into the neighborhood's logic. Once it was crossed, and once the response unfolded quietly, the rule became permanent. No enforcement cycle followed. No reminders were issued. The line simply existed. That's the part that often gets misunderstood. This wasn't about Bumpy Johnson asserting dominance through reaction. He didn't need to. The system around him functioned because people understood where stability lived and where it ended. Family wasn't part of negotiation. It wasn't a pressure point. It wasn't a message to be sent. It was outside the game entirely. Once that was clarified, everything else adjusted naturally. Harlem didn't become quieter because it was intimidated. It became quieter because it was aligned. Disputes stayed smaller. Conflicts resolved earlier. Escalation stopped being a default. The neighborhood didn't need constant correction. It needed clarity once. And that clarity lasted. This is why the story matters beyond one night or one man. It shows how real power often operates when it works best, not through repetition, not through noise, but through a single moment that resets expectations for everyone involved. No headlines marked the change, no public warning announced it. But from that night forward, the line was understood, and it was never tested again. Because the strongest boundaries aren't enforced by violence, they're enforced by memory. And in Harlem, memory was enough.